Welcome back. So the intro to gram-negative video ended up right on this slide. Again, we are trying to tackle lots of different gram-negative bacteria. Actually, while I'm on here, I want to go back to kind of our big flow chart. So again, lots of gram-negative bacteria, and although they are divided first by shape, there's really only one gram-negative cocci bacteria that affects humans, which means there's lots and lots of gram-negative bacilli. And so we sort them out based on oxygen requirement, and our first group, which is the largest group, are the facultatively anaerobic bacteria, the ones that can survive in both oxygenated environments and unoxygenated. They prefer oxygen, but they can survive in an anaerobic environment. Because there are so many facultatively anaerobic, we try to divide them. It's not an even division, into two families, the family of Enterobacteriaceae and Pasteurellaceae, doing an oxidase test. It's a lab test, and again, it's not an easy division, and this group is not the only bacteria that's oxidase positive, but these are the ones that are facultatively anaerobic and oxidase positive. So we kind of got right into that. We left off in the last video talking about how we sort out all of these Enterobacteriaceae. And again, they do have that prefix entero in them, which does mean that they are all found in the intestine. Except one, there is one exception. They're all intestinally found, and generally intestinal issue bacteria. Now, let me get back to the slide the first video left off on. Again, trying to just divide up all of those Enterobacteriaceae, because there are a lot of fecal-borne, facultatively anaerobic, oxidase-negative bacteria. So the three groups, the coliforms, which can ferment lactose, so on a McConkey plate, they would show as pink colonies. The non-coliforms, which do not ferment lactose, and then our true pathogens that even if you're a healthy individual, you can pick up this bacteria just as easily. So starting with our coliform group, which is the largest group in the Enterobacteriaceae, and E. coli is the most common coliform bacteria that affects humans. We hear a lot of recalls on E. coli. There is a lot of E. coli out there. My only note, and I'm like, not all E. coli are the same as each other. Although they are all the exact same genus and species, kind of my example is, you guys are all the exact same genus and species. All humans are Homo sapiens, yet we're not genetically the same. That is the same with bacteria. All E. coli are E. coli. They're all Escherichia coli. They're all the same genus and species, but they're not genetically the same as each other. They each have their own unique DNA. And so you have lots of E. coli in your intestinal tract right now. That does good things for you. When you hear about E. coli being recalled, it's because it's the strains that contain that certain DNA that makes them pathogenic E. coli. So not all E. coli are bad. They get a bad rap, but they're not all bad. Now, E. coli, because it is found in your intestinal tract as part of your normal flora, if it goes somewhere where it's not supposed to be, which is right next door into the urinary tract, it is the #1 cause of urinary tract infections. Again, it's a opportunistic bacteria. It's part of your normal flora and does great things for you in the intestinal tract, but we don't want it to move from the intestinal tract. Now, some of the E. coli strains that we do get concerned about, and these are the ones that cause recalls on various food products, there are 6 strains of E. coli, so they have their own unique DNA, and they all produce a toxin called the Shiga toxin. Now, they are all genetically different from each other, but just like you guys get first names, middle names, and last names to identify you, bacteria don't do those, because they already have E. coli, but they're different from each other. And so they get letters and numbers. And so out of the 6 types or strains of bacteria that can cause gastroenteritis, that's inflammation of the stomach and the intestines, it's really bad diarrhea, the E. coli strain 0157H7 is the most deadly strain. And again, there are other strains. There are 6 main strains that cause gastroenteritis, and these are the strains that cause recalls on food. Now, the Shiga toxin that they produce, it inhibits or stops protein synthesis. in our cells. And we need proteins for everything. We need it for structural material, we need it for enzymes. And so this is a toxin that causes lots of damage to our bodies. Now, developed countries like ours actually have more cases of this particular strain of bacteria than developing countries. And so it does cause severe diarrhea. It causes hemorrhagic colitis, which is inflammation of the colon with bleeding. It can also cause hemolytic uremic syndrome, is that the toxin is destroying platelets, your red blood cell count is done, and it's damaging the kidneys. Again, it can be deadly, and it can do damage to the body if you're infected. Now, again, not all E. coli are the same. It's the strain 0157. So when you hear a recall of E. coli, it's because it contains the 0157 strain. Now, some foods are more likely to contain this particular strain. Undercooked beef, milk, especially unpasteurized or raw milk, various types of unpasteurized juices, and vegetables that you don't wash off. This is a fecally found bacteria, even the deadly strain of it, and vegetables that you don't wash off were probably fertilized with manure. Okay, everyone eats poop, so wash those vegetables off. I'm not going to bring up this little article. It was just kind of a funny article, the La Crosse Tribune, a couple years ago. We had an outbreak of this particular strain. I was only going to bring it up because they did a pretty poor job at scientific writing on how they wrote E. coli. I'm going to bring it up, but it's probably going to. I'm just going to show you a couple points. Just the fact that they have, and I'm like, a dash instead of a period, a lowercase e. We don't know what the e stands for. I'm like, they just don't write it very well. Let me get rid of all that. Now, another coliform bacteria, again, it does show up as pink colonies on a McConkey plate, is Klebsiella. Now, there are lots of strains of Klebsiella, or lots of species, and I'm like, some of them are found in the digestive tract, some of them are found in the respiratory tract. They can cause infections there if they're growing uncontrolled. They can cause infections if someone's immunocompromised. Their big claim to fame, their big virulence factor that allow them to cause disease more readily is that all Klebsiella do have a capsule. So when you have the capsule stain, you can see that white halo around it, and it causes a lot of opportunistic infections. Again, when it starts to grow uncontrolled or when it gets to someplace it's not supposed to be. Now, one species of Klebsiella is more common at causing human disease, and that's Klebsiella pneumoniae. And yes, it can get into the respiratory tract and cause pneumonia based on its name, but it's not the only thing it can cause. It can get into the bloodstream, cause bacteremia. It can get into the cerebrospinal fluid. It can cause meningitis. It can get into open wounds and cause wound infections. It can get into the urinary tract and cause UTIs. Just depends on where it goes. So even though, yes, its name says pneumonia, it's not the only thing that it can cause. Another coliform, lots of coliform, is the Serratia. Unique one about this one is that when you grow it on a nutrient agar, not a blood agar plate, but just a nutrient agar that doesn't have red blood cells, it actually has a red pigment to it. So this is a nutrient agar that doesn't have red blood cells, and that's the bacteria that actually has that red pigment on it. Now, most of the time, it's not a really common bacteria. Most of the time, it's diagnosed and found in those that are elderly, immunocompromised. Those that use catheters have an increased risk of picking up this bacteria. It can be found in other hospital supplies. So it is generally a healthcare-associated infection. Most people pick it up while in healthcare settings or while using some type of healthcare device like a catheter. It is getting harder to treat, though, because it is starting to show resistance to a lot of our antibacterial drugs. Our next group of coliforms, and I group them together because they're kind of all found in generally the same place and do the same thing. Enterobacter, again, it has entero in the name. It is an intestinal bacteria. Hafnia and Citrobacter. They're all generally found out in some type of environmental source. So they're found in contaminated water, in soil, on different kinds of vegetation or sewage. Some of them are found in the digestive tract, is where they get their name, of animals and humans. And Enterobacter is also usually tied to a lot of different dairy products. Now, most of these usually only cause issues for immunocompromised patients, and they're usually picked up while in a healthcare setting, so they are healthcare-associated infecting bacteria. They are, however, getting more difficult to treat as every year they're becoming more resistant to antimicrobial drugs. Now, we're moving on to our non-coliforms. So on a McConkey plate, they would not show us the pink colonies. And there's really only one main non-coliform bacteria that causes human disease, and that's Proteus mirabilis. So it's the most common of all of the non-coliforms out there. And again, we don't go over every bacteria in this class. We'd be here forever. We're going over all the top ones that cause disease. And the top non-coliform bacteria is the Proteus. It causes a lot of UTIs. It's an Enterobacter in that Enterobacteriaceae group. It's usually tied for those that use long-term catheters. Because of an enzyme that it makes called urease, it actually leads to the making of kidney stones. If suffering from a UTI wasn't bad enough, now you've got kidney stones to go along with it. It's becoming resistant to a lot of our antimicrobial drugs. And it is a flagellated bacteria. And so this is one, we did have a plate of this in lab, that it doesn't stay in its isolated colony. It will spread out from that initial source. Even our normal swarming bacteria, our normal motile bacteria, they still generally stay in their own colony and they don't swim around in a fluid. This one doesn't care. It doesn't need a fluid. It will cover the entire plate on any kind of nutrient-rich plate. Now, the last group of Enterobacteriaceae, we're still in the same family, lots of intestinal bacteria. These are the true pathogens, which means it doesn't matter how healthy you are, these can cause disease just as easily in you than someone that's immunocompromised. And part of that is they have a lot of virulence factors, a lot of things that allow them to cause disease. They're not part of your normal flora, these are just disease-causing bacteria. And one of their big virulence factors is that they all have something called a type 3 secretion system. So this is the bacterial cell, there's the membrane, the wall, and this is the host cell, our cells. When they attach to our host cells, they can actually inject various virulence factors into our cells. That can, one, inhibit phagocytosis so that they don't get eaten, because if you're a bacteria, you don't want to be eaten. They can change the shape of the host cell that might allow them to get somewhere new, and they can kill the host cell. They can induce apoptosis or cell suicide. Again, if you can kill the cell, sometimes that allows those bacteria to enter into new areas in the body. All good things for the bacteria, all bad things for us. Now, there are three main genera that cause, or that fall into this true pathogen group, the Salmonella, the Shigella, and the Yersinia. Most of you are familiar with the first one, the Salmonella, because we hear a lot of recalls on Salmonella. Now, Salmonella is found in the intestines and the feces of birds, reptiles, mammals, and yes, we usually pick it up because we ingest animal feces. And everyone's like, no, we don't eat poop. Yeah, you do. Sorry to break it to you. Poop is everywhere. Fecal matter is everywhere. And we normally pick it up when we are ingesting poultry. Again, fecal matter can get on that, the meat source it is, or the meat source, so when you handle it, the bacteria is there. If you don't kill the bacteria when you cook it, it's there. The bacteria can actually get into eggs. Again, it's not very far from the intestinal tract of where that egg comes from. So the bacteria can get in the eggs and it can reproduce. So, we normally pick it up from poultry, but it's not the only animal we can pick it up from. This particular bacteria is not just found in chickens, it's found in other birds, it's found in other mammals, it's found in reptiles. It's just most often we pick it up, we test and have recalls for chicken products. Now, if you did ingest something that had this particular bacteria, you suffer from salmonellosis, and my next slide will kind of show how this is, why all of these symptoms occur. But it's your basic but pretty extreme food poisoning: diarrhea, vomiting, fever, headache. Some strains of Salmonella can cause typhoid fever, which I'll talk about in a couple slides. And as we are starting to use more antibiotics, we're actually seeing more cases of Salmonella. It's starting to increase the carrier state as we start to kill other bacteria. This bacteria is surviving, and we're seeing more people carry this bacteria. So we're seeing more cases of this bacteria. Now, if you did ingest something that had this bacteria, it's generally going to affect the small intestine. How I know that's the small intestine is you have the microvilli that gives that big surface area in the small intestine. And again, it's going to get inside of our cells, but it does not get broken down. So our cells are not going to get broken down. Instead, it's going to reproduce inside of our cells. It's ultimately going to kill the cells of that line the small intestine. And it's generally once those cells that line the small intestine realize they're under attack, that the body does something about it. That the body knows we're under attack, we need to get rid of whatever is attacking us, and diarrhea is the fastest way to get rid of something that's in the intestinal tract. So that's normally when you're going to get, as soon as those cells start to die, you're going to have instant, really bad diarrhea. Just your body's way of trying to get rid of the bacteria. Now, sometimes the bacteria can move into the bloodstream, but because it is the intestine, we usually have a lot of white blood cells concentrated around the intestinal tract to find them and get rid of them. So they generally don't cause a lot of issues once they get into the bloodstream. However, there is one strain of Salmonella that can cause more issues than just basic food poisoning, and that's the Salmonella enterica serotype typhi. Humans are the only host, so animals are not. We pick it up by eating contaminated food or water, and since we're the only host, that means you're eating or drinking feces, human feces. And this is one strain, the serotype typhi. It doesn't get letters and numbers like 0157. Instead, it just gets serotype typhi, that when it does cross the intestines, it can get into the bloodstream, and it's going to lead to an extreme fever. That fever itself can be extreme enough that it can be deadly. But if you know, the cases are going down for this particular strain, mostly because we know of how the transmission sequence is, and we're trying to, clean up the water, make sure you're not drinking fecal contaminated water or eating fecal contaminated food. So the cases of this particular strain have gone way down. And if you know you're going to a country or somewhere where they still are having cases, we do have a vaccine that provides some temporary protection while you're there traveling. Now, this is just to show that as we've been using antibiotics, the actual cases of Salmonella has been on the rise. Again, more people are carrying it. Now, treatment, if you're suffering from this particular bacteria, we do have a lot of antimicrobial drugs. It's not really showing a lot of resistance to drugs right now. Another true pathogen is Shigella, also found in the digestive tract of humans, and this particular bacteria produces the Shiga toxin. So Shiga toxin from Shigella, but it's the exact same Shiga toxin that E. coli can make, and that the deadly strains of E. coli, the 0157. And again, they stop protein synthesis in the host cells. Now, Mike, it is a bacteria that causes severe diarrhea. I feel a sneeze coming on. Hold on. Excuse me. And there are 4 species of Shigella. They all seem to be kind of confined to their own areas of the world. So kind of just depends where you go, depends on which species you pick up, but they're generally all going to cause severe diarrhea. Now, Salmonella, the other true pathogen we just got done talking about, affects the small intestine. This particular strain affects the large intestine. Again, it doesn't have the microvilli like the small intestine does. It does get inside of the cells that line the large intestine. It's going to reproduce. It doesn't get broken down. And ultimately, it's going to start to kill the cells of the large intestine. That's, again, what's going to trigger the severe diarrhea. It also can get into the bloodstream, but just like Salmonella, we do have a lot of white blood cells near our digestive tract. And so they're right there ready to get rid of the bacteria. So it's generally not going to cause anything more severe than extreme diarrhea. But again, depending on where in the world you are, the diarrhea could be deadly. Our true pathogen group, our last group of Enterobacteriaceae, these intestinal bacteria, is Yersinia. There are 3 main human disease Yersinia: the Enterocolitica, the pseudotuberculosis, and the Yersinia pestis. And if you had to have a Yersinia, you'd want one of the first 2. Yersinia enterocolitica, based on its name, it affects the intestines. It causes inflammation of the colon. We pick it up by, again, eating contaminated food or water that has fecal matter in it. It causes inflammation of the intestinal tract, going to lead to that diarrhea. Pseudotuberculosis also causes inflammation of the intestines, less severe than the enterocolitica. You'd have some minor diarrhea. Not bad. Yersinia pestis, though, is highly virulent, meaning very likely to cause disease, and it's our one non-enteric. So genetically, it is a Yersinia. However, it's not intestinally found. So although it gets the name, it's in the group, it's not actually intestinally found. Now, depending on how you pick it up, you're either going to develop what's called the bubonic plague or the pneumonic plague, which anything that ends in plague is never good. And it just depends on how you picked up the bacteria. So this particular bacteria is found normally in fleas. That's the normal endemic host. And rodents. I was going to say fleas can amplify, meaning when a flea bites one of these infected small animals, the bacteria which is in these animals and growing will just continue to grow in a biting insect like a flea. When the flea bites us, or if we have direct contact with one of these infected animals, this bacteria can get into our bloodstream and can get into our lymphatic system, our immune system. So if we get something from the flea bite or direct contact with an infected animal, bacteria gets into the bloodstream, gets into the lymphatic system, and you now have something called the bubonic plague. Now, why we call it that? This particular bacteria is going to cause extreme inflammation of the lymph nodes. And now, it's usually going to cause extreme inflammation of the lymph nodes closest to the infection site. So you do have a lymph node in your groin area, and an extremely inflamed lymph node is called a bubo, and that's where we get the name bubonic plague from. So, and I'm like, you suffer from the bubonic plague if you get bitten or if the bacteria gets into the bloodstream. This bacteria, however, can be transmitted airborne, and it's going to affect the lungs. That's when you have the pneumonic plague. Less deadly to have the pneumonic plague than the bubonic plague. It generally causes a pneumonia, severe pneumonia, but not as deadly. It is the bubonic plague. Now, diagnosing someone with this bacteria, well, it has to happen because by the time you have symptoms, it's generally deadly within a week. Now, they're usually going to look for some of the characteristic symptoms. You're going to have some type of fever. You're going to have a white blood cell response, but you're going to have extremely swollen lymph nodes. Treatment also has to be very fast because this bacteria works really fast. We do have lots of antibacterial drugs that work. We're almost, I'd have to double check again because I know we are in the process of developing a vaccine. There's not a lot of cases of this anymore, but there are still cases. So this is not a bacteria that's gone away. And I'm like, but before we had antibacterial drugs, this was an extremely deadly bacteria. So we're very fortunate that we have these drugs right now to be able to treat for infections. This is just to show that although the Enterobacteriaceae are fecally found, it's not the only places they can infect. They can get to lots of different parts of the body and cause lots of different issues. Now, our last group, still in the facultatively anaerobic, but these are in the family of Pasteurellaceae. When we divide them up, these are oxidase positive. Again, they're not the only organisms that are oxidase positive, but they're the only organisms that are facultatively anaerobic and oxidase positive. And it's a much smaller group. So in our Pasteurellaceae group, one of the first genus that's in there is Pasteurella. And the only main Pasteurella that affects humans is Pasteurella multisida. Now, this is a bacteria that is normally found in the mouths and nose of animals, including your pets at home, cats and dogs. How we pick it up is when they bite you, and we get it from their mouth, or the inhalation of aerosols, because I swear my dog, when she needs to sneeze, waits till she's straight in my face and sneezes on me. It is one place you can pick it up. Now, normally what it causes is inflammation at those bite sites. So if you ever get bitten by an animal and you're like, oh, it looks inflamed, it might be this particular bacteria. Now, if you're a healthy individual, your immune system can get rid of it. If you're not as healthy, you might need to take some antibiotics, and we do have lots of antibacterial drugs that can get rid of the infection. Penicillin's usually the first one they go for. Now, when we're trying to diagnose this particular bacteria, this is one of those picky eater bacterias. It's called the fastidious bacteria. We need to grow them up on the chocolate blood augurs, meaning we need to cook and break apart the red blood cells first, because they would like those red blood cells broken down for them. So it's a little picky eater. Generally, anything in the Pasteurellaceae group are the picky eaters and require those chocolate blood augurs. The next bacteria, the next genus that's in this Pasteurellaceae group is Haemophilus Now, there are lots of Haemophilus species. The main one, because we've got one more to talk about, is Haemophilus influenzae. Now, it does not cause the flu, that's a virus, but it does get the name of influenzae. Its main virulence factor is that it does have a capsule. Underneath the microscope, they are pleomorphic rods, and so the rods can be different sizes from each other. And there are different strains of Haemophilus influenza. The deadliest strain is Haemophilus influenza type B. It would cause a very deadly meningitis and a very deadly epiglottitis. In the past, we do not see very many cases anymore because we have a very effective vaccine called the Hib vaccine, which, if you never knew, it stands for Haemophilus influenza type B. However, some other Haemophilus influenza strains, not type B, can still cause bronchitis, they can still cause ear infections, they can still cause sinus infections, and usually the kids are the top ones that pick up this particular bacterial strain. So we've kind of eliminated the type B strain, but there's still other Haemophilus influenza strains out there, not very deadly though. And then we also have our last Haemophilus, our second Haemophilus, I guess, but our last Pasteurellaceae group. It's the Haemophilus ducreyi. It's our one sexually transmitted bacteria that we're going to talk about. It's not super common. I don't even get a fun picture on there. I mean, I guess I could put a picture. I don't know if you want it, because its main symptom is in males it causes genital ulcers or cankroids. Females are usually asymptomatic. Yay, us. However, problem with being asymptomatic is you could be spreading the bacteria with having no idea that you were. So it generally just causes genital ulcers. Now, on to our next oxygen requirement, our aerobic bacteria. Now, this might also be a good time if you wanted to take a break, pause it, then you could try to find this slide as you're scrolling through the video again. But these are ones, they are all aerobic. They cannot grow in any type of anaerobic environment. Now, 3 genera that can do it, Brucella, Bordetella, Pseudomonas francisella, and Legionella. Most people are most familiar with the Bordetella, so we'll get there. So the first one, though, is Brucella. It's non-modal, it's a coxobacilli, so they're almost round, but not quite. And of all the Brucella, the only one that causes human diseases is Brucella melitenensis, and it only affects humans. Now, it's normally found in various types of animals, and we pick it up by having contact with infected animal parts, or drinking or eating different contaminated dairy products. Now, this bacteria, for some, you may be asymptomatic. For some, it's a mild disease. But one of the big symptoms that this bacteria causes is a fluctuating fever. Normally, when you're sick, you just have a fever, like 101, 102. This is a bacteria, though, that you could have a fever of 101, half an hour it's down to 99, half an hour later it's up to 103, another half an hour later it goes back to 99. It varies quite a bit. Now, because the fever can get extreme, this is and can be a very deadly bacteria. And so we pick it up by infected animals, we can pick it up by different dairy products, so those that work in the dairy industry or with farm animals are generally the ones that are higher risk. However, it is a bacteria, though, that can go airborne and can be spread through aerosolization. Now, because it can be deadly and because it can be airborne, it is the #1 lab-acquired infection. And so about 24% of all cases of Brucella melitenensis are actually lab workers. They're the ones that are working with all of these different bacteria. And so it is a bacteria to be concerned about, because it can be deadly even for healthy individuals because of that extreme fever. Now, onto the Bordetella that most people are familiar with. It's also non-modal. It's also a coxobacilli, so they're very short rods. And the most common Bordetella that people hear of is Bordetella pertussis, which causes the disease pertussis, but it's more commonly known as whooping cough, the main symptom. Infants are at highest risk of picking up this bacteria. Again, we cannot vaccinate a baby can't be born in that same day we start giving it vaccines. Their immune system isn't ready to recognize those things. It's definitely not ready to mount an immune response. And so we generally don't give the vaccine till infants turn 1. Like there's other vaccines we're giving them, but we can't overload them with everything. So infants are at highest risk of picking up the bacteria, and infants are also at highest risk of then suffering from the most severe symptoms. Now, the bacteria's virulence factors, the main ones, is that it does have adhesin proteins that allow it to stick to cells of our respiratory tract, and it also has several toxins that destroy the cells of the respiratory tract. It's spread by aerosols, which means we breathe it in when someone's coughing or talking and this bacteria is coming out. It's going to stick to the cells of a respiratory tract, as shown in these pictures. It's sticking to those ciliated cells of your respiratory tract, and it's going to destroy and kill the cells of your respiratory tract. Now, the time course for this particular bacteria is in weeks, not days. And so if someone coughed on you that was infected, for the first week and a half, you're asymptomatic. The bacteria, however, is still growing in your respiratory tract and multiplying, which means you could be spreading it. Then for maybe about another week and a half, you're going to enter in what's known as the catarrhal phase. You have a rhinorrhea, that's a runny nose, sneezing, tired, fever. At this point, most people just think they just have a basic cold, which you generally don't go to the hospital with for either. Bacteria are still reproducing and multiplying, and you're still infecting other people at this point. Then you enter in what's known as the paroxysmal phase. And although the bacteria count might be decreasing, what those bacteria did to your respiratory tract has fully destroyed your respiratory tract. They have been killing cells, and you've now entered into the phase where you're gasping for breath because they've destroyed cells of the respiratory tract and you're not getting enough oxygen. And so it triggers a repetitive coughing with whooping. That's the gasping of breath. It can lead to vomiting because you are coughing so much, so hard, and just so often that actually a lot of individuals die of just physical exhaustion. If you're coughing nonstop, you're not eating. If you're coughing nonstop, you're not sleeping. And the time period that you are coughing this long is weeks. This is not 1 or 2 days where you don't get sleep or you don't eat for a day or two. You can survive on that. But 3 weeks of not eating, not sleeping, for infants, it's deadly. Now, even if you survive the 3 weeks, you still go into the convalescence where you're still going to have an annoying cough and other complications because you've destroyed the respiratory tract, which means everything you breathe in can most likely cause disease. So it's a very deadly bacteria, and its time course is over weeks. Now, let's see if my audio works. I'm not going to sure if this is going to work or not. Let's see.
Hamilton County Board of Health gives an example of what whooping cough sounds like. Take a listen here.
All right. So I'm like, so sad. Again, it's coughing and just gasping for breath. I can't imagine as a parent how traumatizing that would be for just the parent, let alone the kid. Now, to diagnose an infection, they can go based on symptoms. That is a very characteristic cough, that cough with gasping for breath and non-stop. But just a symptom alone is not diagnostic. Oops, I want the picture. They will, however, they can grow up the lab, they can do antibody tests, they can do DNA tests, but they are going to get a specimen from the nasopharyngeal region.
Now remember, whooping cough,
skinny swab way back in the nasopharyngeal region. An unfortunate part for treatment is just supportive. By the time you have symptoms, the damage to your respiratory tract is completely done. It has destroyed the respiratory tract. And so it's just supportive treatment. They're going to give you, put you on oxygen to try to increase your oxygen. They're going to try to do some type of steroids to open up airwaves. And I'm like, but it's all supportive treatment. They can give you antibiotics to try to kill any remaining bacteria that are in your body, but it's not really going to help you. It's just going to help stop you spreading it, but it's not going to help you. It's a completely preventable bacteria, though. It is, we have a vaccine. It is the P in the DTaP or the P in the Tdap. Now, I do always have questions of why is one capitalized and why is one lowercase? Generally, the first shot that you're given is the capital. It's to elicit a stronger immune response. Boosters is generally the lowercase p. It's just the reminder to your immune system about the particular bacteria to make sure you've got enough antibodies. Now, when we came out with a vaccine, the number of cases went way down, but the trend for the number of cases of pertussis has gone way up, and it is absolutely because people have stopped vaccinating for it. It is not uncommon that you hear a lot of mothers that will outright say, like, don't come visit this newborn unless you can prove you've been vaccinated. And it's smart because we can't vaccinate the newborns, and if you're not vaccinated, you could be spreading it without even knowing it, because it hasn't shown its symptoms yet. Now, our next aerobic gram-negative rod, I shortened it because I didn't want to write out a whole gram-negative rod up there, is Pseudomonas aeruginosa. It's not part of our normal flora. It's normally found out in the environment, in soil, and organic matter, but even though it's found normally in the environment, it's normally picked up in hospital settings. So not part of fecal matter, but it is picked up in hospital settings. It can colonize and grow anywhere in the body. It can be very, very deadly. It's always going to cause the most severe signs and symptoms for immunocompromised patients. Couple different groups that seem to suffer the worst are cystic fibrosis patients and burn victims. Now, the correlation between those two. This is a bacteria that really thrives on that moist environment. I mean, bacteria like a warm, moist environment. This one really likes that moisture. Cystic fibrosis patients have excessive mucus in the respiratory tract, and that excessive mucus is that moist environment they love. Burn victims, as shown on this picture, they've lost their first line of defense. They've lost their skin. So all their interstitial fluid can be leaking out of their body, and that's that moist environment that the bacteria like. Now, this bacteria, when it grows, it does produce a greenish pigment, which is what we can actually see through the bandages on this particular individual. It's also a bacteria that is oxidase positive. And I'm like, just Pasteurellaceae are not the only bacteria that are oxidase positive. This one is too. It's just Pasteurellaceae are the only oxidase positive that are facultatively anaerobic. Now, the unfortunate part is picked up usually in hospital settings for the ones that are, immunocompromised, and it is a really hard to treat bacteria. This particular bacteria is becoming very drug resistant, and so it is becoming deadly for a lot of individuals. Now, because it is picked up primarily in hospital settings, and I'm like, it is a top cause of healthcare associated infections. Most gram-negative healthcare associated infections all in those Enterobacteriaceae group, fecal-borne. But Pseudomonas, not fecal-borne, but it's still a top cause of healthcare-associated infections. Our next aerobic gram-negative rod, the Francisella tularensis. Shape-wise, it's a coxobacillus, so again, it's tiny, a little tiny rod. And its main virulence factor, it is an intracellular parasite. So it can get inside of our cells, and it will kill our cells before our cells kill it, and obviously is going to cause a lot of damage. Now, there's lots of different animals that seem to carry this particular bacteria in the United States. Rabbits, muskrats, and ticks are the top ones. Rabbits seem to be the primary ones, so I'm like, but we've got a lot of ticks around here, so if you get bitten by an infected animal or a tick, you can pick up this bacteria. Because it is more commonly found in rabbits than in ticks, when you pick it up, and because of the fever that it causes, it does get the nickname of rabbit fever. Now, other than getting bitten by an infected animal, eating infected meat from one of these animals, if you eat rabbit or muskrat, I don't know if people eat muskrats, by drinking contaminated water that has bacteria, or even aerosols if you're around these particular animals. It is extremely infectious. The infectious dose is only 10. It means if you breathe in just 10, you're going to suffer from this bacterial infection. Because of the fever that this particular bacteria can cause, especially for those that don't get treated in time, it causes 30% of, or a 30% mortality rate or death rate if left untreated. And I'm like, it can be an extremely deadly bacteria. Now, we do have a vaccine for at-risk individuals if you're around a lot of infected possible rabbits. We do have a vaccine. It's not super common. I've only heard of a couple cases of individuals actually picking up this, and generally not in our area. It's normally they've traveled. Now, because the infectious dose is so low, and because if left untreated it can be so deadly, it does make it on our poster of Agents of Bioterrorism. And I'm like, just because of the low infectious dose and the high mortality rate. Other ones that are on there, Brucella, that Brucella melitensis that lab workers pick up, the anthracis, the gram-positive bacteria, because it can get into the lungs and be deadly, and the Yersinia pestis, the plague bacteria. Our last aerobic gram-negative rod is Legionella pneumophila. It's pleomorphic rods, and so they can change in their shape, but they're all still rods. This bacteria is always found in water. And so we generally pick it up when we inhale the bacteria from water sources. So whether you inhale water from when you take a shower, whether you inhale water when you're in a hot tub, which is the perfect warm, moist environment, even grocery store misters can contain this particular bacteria, and you can inhale it when it's doing its misting. Now, if you pick it up, this Legionella, the disease is called Legionnaire's disease. It causes fever, chills, pneumonia, diarrhea. It can be fatal in immunocompromised individuals. Now, we haven't really, it's not a super common bacteria, but it has been. And like we've seen cases in the last year or two. We've had kind of a big outbreak last winter. In the Dells, we had cases. There were a couple different water parks that had this bacteria in their water supply, that they had cases. No one died, but there were cases of it. Again, it's pretty rare. We had a couple cases in Madison at the UW Health where it did actually kill individuals because they were there, they were immunocompromised, and they picked it up from the water system. The water system in the hospital was not getting treated correctly before it was going out to patients. So it's not super common, but kind of surprising. We've actually have had some cases around here. It is treatable. We do have antibiotics that can treat it. However, sometimes depending on how long you wait to get treated, the bacteria could have already done damage, and the bacteria is working faster than the antibiotics working. Now, our last group are strictly anaerobic gram-negative rods, and there's only 2 genera in there. Now, we do have a lot of anaerobic gram-negative rod bacteria that are out there. We have a lot of them that are part of the normal flora of your digestive tract, your gastrointestinal tract, and the reproductive tract, and your upper respiratory tract, and a lot of them do good things for us. So we can find a lot of them in different parts of our body. They can inhibit the growth of other organisms with that competition. Some of them can make vitamins. They can vitamin precursors. Some of them that are found in the digestive tract help in digestion. However, they can cause disease though, especially if they're found in a new location that they're not normally found in. So a lot of normal flora that are anaerobic gram-negative rods. But there are 2 main genera that cause issues, especially if they go somewhere new. The first is bacterioids. And that we have bacterioids, normal flora of your intestine and your upper respiratory tract. However, Bacterius fragilis can, especially if it goes somewhere else, can cause issues. It has a lot of virulence factors that allow it to grow in different parts of the body, not just the intestine and upper respiratory tract. And depending on where it goes, depends on what kind of condition you suffer. If it gets into the stomach, into other parts of the digestive tract, it can cause abdominal infections. If it gets into the reproductive tract, it can cause genital infections, usually just in women. If it gets into open wounds, it can cause wound infections. It's treatable though. Metronidazole is our top antibiotic that we use to treat it. Now, because we do have 2 genera, our bacterioids and our next one, our Provotella, they both look the same. They're both anaerobic gram-negative rods. The big way to tell them apart is whether they can grow in the presence of bile or not. And so this particular plate, it is a selective plate. It does have bile added to it, which is an inhibitor for a lot of bacteria. This bacteria, though, is not inhibited. Again, it's normally found in the intestine where bile is found. So this is a bacteria that knows how to survive in an environment with bile. So it will grow in the presence of bile, unlike our next bacteria that normally found in the urinary, reproductive, and upper respiratory tract, nowhere found in the intestinal tract. So it has not evolved with bile, and so it would not grow on a plate that contains bile. So we can use that bile plate to sort out which anaerobic gram-negative rod is. It does have several virulence factors that allow it to cause disease, and again, depending on where the bacteria goes, depends on what kind of infection. It can cause sinus infections, ear infections, it can cause infections in the mouth, it can cause various gynecological infections, it can get into the bloodstream and cause issues in the brain, it can cause abdominal infections, kind of depending on what kind of infection you have, depending on your immune system. They might need to remove infected tissue if it's bad enough. Otherwise, they usually give you a broad spectrum antibiotic. Carbapenemum seems to be the top one that they give out, but we do have different antibiotics that do work at killing it. So, lots of anaerobic gram-negative rods, and really just one anaerobic, or one, so I shouldn't say anaerobic gram-negative rods, lots of gram-negative rod bacteria. So we just got done going over a lot of gram-negative bacteria. Most of them all have the same shape, which means in labs we do need to do a lot of different type of tests to help sort it out, because just doing a gram stain is not going to tell us too much about which bacteria it is. So now that you finished this video, you should be good to go ahead and take the online quiz.